The conference room in the Reich Air Ministry smelled of leather and stale tobacco when Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall of the Luftwaffe, heard the American production figure. 50,000 aircraft. He leaned back, the oak chair groaning under his weight, and laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a full-throated roar that echoed off the marble walls. His subordinates, maps of Europe pinned behind them, joined the laughter nervously. It was May 1940, and the Blitzkrieg had just torn through France in 6 weeks. German fighters owned the sky. American industry, Göring assured them, was soft, capable of making refrigerators and automobiles for housewives, but not the instruments of modern war. 50,000 planes was a fantasy, a politician's promise meant to calm a frightened public across the Atlantic. He dismissed it with a wave, turned to the next briefing, and never considered the possibility that he had just made the most catastrophic miscalculation of the war. Across that Atlantic, in a converted warehouse in Burbank, California, the air tasted of aluminum dust and cutting oil. Rows of women in coveralls stood at drill presses, the whine of metal on metal drowning out conversation. Overhead cranes swung skeletal fuselage frames past fluorescent lights that buzzed through the night shift. The floor vibrated with the rhythm of hydraulic presses shaping wing ribs from flat sheets. Outside, the parking lot stretched half a mile, filled with Fords and Chevrolets belonging to workers who had never touched an aircraft before December 1941. They had been farmers, teachers, seamstresses, soda jerks. Now they were riveters, welders, inspectors, assemblers. The factory ran 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. Steam rose from the canteen where soup simmered in 50-gallon drums. The smell of hot coffee mixed with the tang of primer paint. A woman named Evelyn Kellerman, 32, formerly a rural schoolteacher from Iowa, walked the production line with a clipboard checking torque values on engine mounts. Her call sign in the test division was Compass, earned because she never got lost in the labyrinth of the factory's 12 assembly bays. She wore a leather jacket with a patch showing a propeller cutting through a cloud. Her hands, calloused now, moved with the precision of someone who understood that a loose bolt at altitude meant a crew of 10 never coming home. The contradiction lived in the numbers. Göring's intelligence officers had estimated American aircraft production capacity based on peacetime output. They saw civilian factories making cars at a rate of 3 million per year and assumed the same methods, handcrafted fittings, custom tooling, slow assembly, would apply to bombers and fighters. What they missed was the transformation already underway in American industrial thought. Henry Ford had spent 2 decades perfecting the moving assembly line, breaking complex tasks into repeatable motions that could be taught in days rather than years. When Boeing, Consolidated, Douglas, and Lockheed received their contracts in 1940, they didn't build aircraft the European way. They built assembly systems. Jigs and fixtures replaced skilled hand-fitting. Subassemblies arrived from satellite plants already complete, ready to snap into place. A B-24 Liberator bomber, which would have taken 12,000 man-hours to build using traditional methods, rolled off the line in Willow Run, Michigan, in 63 minutes by 1944. Göring had laughed at the plan for 50,000 planes. By the time he realized his mistake, America had delivered 100,000, and the sky over Germany belonged to someone else. The first wave of that realization arrived in the summer of 1943, not in Berlin but in a railroad marshalling yard outside Schweinfurt, a town known for ball-bearing factories. The yard master, a man named Klaus Hartmann, stood on the platform at 400 hours, watching fog roll through the rails. He heard them before he saw them, a sound like distant thunder except it didn't fade. It grew. The air vibrated. Workers loading coal cars stopped, looked up. The sound became a roar, then a physical pressure in the chest. The fog began to glow orange from the east. Then the first formation appeared, flying at 22,000 feet, 96 B-17 flying fortresses, stacked in combat boxes, each carrying 5,000 pounds of high explosive and incendiary ordnance. Hartmann had seen Luftwaffe bombers before, Heinkels and Dorniers flying in loose gaggles of 20 or 30. This was different. The Americans flew in precision geometry, each bomber locked into its position within a defensive cube that bristled with 50-caliber machine guns. The formation stretched for miles. Hartmann counted the groups until he lost track. The bombs fell at 4:17, and the marshalling yard ceased to exist. 78 rail cars were destroyed, 14 locomotives torn apart, the main line cut in 11 places. When the smoke cleared, Hartmann found a section of aluminum skin from a bomber's tail, punched through by flak but still bearing stenciled markings. Memphis Belle II 8th Air Force. He folded it, put it in his coat, and walked home through rubble. That night he wrote in his diary, "They are not coming in dozens, they are coming in hundreds, and the sky is full of them." Evelyn Kellerman had been in California when the war started, teaching third grade in a one-room schoolhouse outside Bakersfield. She remembered the morning of Pearl Harbor as a Sunday ruined by static, the radio cutting in and out, her father packing the kitchen, the neighbors gathering in the yard to listen through the window. By January 1942, the schoolhouse had closed for lack of students. The boys over 16 had enlisted or gone to work in the shipyards. The girls followed. Evelyn's younger brother, Thomas, joined the Army Air Forces as a navigator and was dead by October, shot down over the North Sea in a B-24 that never sent a distress call. The telegram arrived on a Thursday. Her mother stopped cooking for a week. Evelyn took a bus to Burbank the following Monday and stood in line for 6 hours outside the Lockheed hearing office. The foreman asked if she could read a blueprint. She said yes, though she had never seen one. He handed her a wrench and told her to torque a bolt to 30 foot-pounds. She did it on the first try, muscle memory from years of tightening the hand crank on a mimeograph machine. He hired her on the spot. Within 3 months, she was leading a team that tested propeller governor systems, the mechanical hearts that controlled blade pitch and engine efficiency. She was good at it, better than most of the men who resented her presence, better than she had expected to be. The work was repetitive and exact. Measure, adjust, measure again, log the data. But it mattered. Every propeller she cleared meant another bomber reached altitude, another crew had a chance to come home. She thought about Thomas every time she signed off on a test sheet. The logistics of what America was attempting defied comprehension even to those building it. The raw material requirements alone redefined industrial planning. A single B-24 Liberator required 30,000 rivets, 14,000 pounds of aluminum, 2 miles of electrical wiring, 50 gallons of paint, and 600 square feet of plexiglass. Building 1,000 bombers per month meant sourcing 30 million rivets, moving 14 million pounds of aluminum, and training riveters fast enough to replace those who quit, got pregnant, or followed husbands to other cities. The supply chain stretched back to bauxite mines in Arkansas, copper smelters in Montana, rubber plantations in Liberia. Trains hauled components across the country in a choreography that made the transcontinental railroad look simple. A bomber's landing gear might be forged in Ohio, assembled in Texas, shipped to California for installation. The tires came from Akron, the radios from New Jersey, the guns from Connecticut. Every part had to arrive on schedule in the correct quantity with 0 defects. A single missing hydraulic fitting could ground a bomber for days. The American answer was redundancy and speed. Build 3 fittings for every one needed, keep warehouses overstocked, move everything by priority rail. Ports groaned under the load. In Long Beach, cranes lifted crated P-51 Mustangs onto Liberty ships bound for England, 24 fighters per vessel, stacked like furniture. Stevedores worked through rain and darkness, floodlights turning the docks into daylight. The smell of creosote and diesel hung over the water. A foreman named Marcus Webb, a black man from Louisiana who had left sharecropping for $12 a day, ran a crew of 36 that averaged 2 ships loaded per week. He told his men that every crate they lifted was a piece of sky that someone else would own. They worked faster. Göring received the first accurate production reports in November 1943 and refused to believe them. His chief of staff, Generaloberst Hans Jeskinek, laid the intelligence summary on the desk. American factories had produced 23,000 aircraft in the previous 6 months. Göring called it Allied propaganda, designed to demoralize German crews. He pointed to the numbers his own factories reported, a steady 8,000 fighters and bombers across the same period. Germany had the best engineers in the world, he said. Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf Junkers. Their aircraft were superior designs, faster, more heavily armed. Quality would defeat quantity. Jeskinek, who had visited a captured B-17 and marveled at its crude but effective turbo-superchargers, said nothing. He knew the truth. America wasn't just building more planes, they were building a different kind of air force. German pilots flew until they died or were too injured to continue. American pilots flew a set number of missions, 25, later 35, then rotated home to train the next generation. German factories relied on skilled craftsmen who couldn't be easily replaced. American factories trained assembly workers in 3 weeks and kept them moving along a line where expertise was distributed across hundreds of tiny tasks. The German system was a master chef preparing a gourmet meal. The American system was a cafeteria serving 10,000. Both fed people, but only one scaled. Jeskinek committed suicide in August 1943, a week after the Schweinfurt raid. Göring never acknowledged the production figures. He simply stopped asking about them. Evelyn received her first letter from a bomber crew in March 1944. It arrived in a manila envelope, forwarded through the factory's public relations office. The handwriting was blocky, written with a pencil that had pressed hard enough to tear through the paper in places. "Dear Compass," it began, using her call sign though she had never transmitted on a radio outside the test hangar. "We flew your bird yesterday. Engines ran clean the whole way. Brought us home on 3 when number 4 took flak over Augsburg. The governor held pitch perfect, thought you'd want to know." It was signed by a pilot named Lieutenant Raymond Kowalski, 100th Bomb Group stationed at Thorpe Abbotts in England. She folded the letter and put it in her locker. A week later, another arrived, this one from a co-pilot in the 91st Bomb Group, then a navigator. Then a flight engineer who detailed how a propeller she had tested saved his life by feathering instantly after a blade snapped over the roar. She started keeping them in a shoebox under her bunk in the women's dormitory. By June, she had 43 letters. She never responded. What would she say? That she torqued bolts and logged temperatures. That she worked in a hangar that smelled of hydraulic fluid and never heard a shot fired. The letters kept coming anyway, a paper trail of gratitude from men she would never meet, some of whom were already dead by the time their letters reached California. She read each one twice, memorized the names, and then filed them in alphabetical order. It was the only way she knew to honor what they had written. The moment Göring's laughter became obsolete can be traced to a specific operation. Big Week, February 2025, 1944. The objective was to destroy the German aircraft industry in a coordinated assault by the 8th and 15th Air Forces, hitting factories in Leipzig, Brunswick, Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, and Schweinfurt. The planners in England knew the cost would be high. Schweinfurt alone had killed 60 bombers and 600 men in a single day the previous October. But the strategy had shifted. America wasn't trying to trade evenly anymore. They were going to trade up, knowing they could replace losses faster than Germany could. On February 20, the weather cleared over England for the first time in weeks. At 6:30 hours, the first bombers lifted from muddy runways across East Anglia, propellers clawing for altitude, wing tips disappearing into cloud layers at 8,000 feet. Over 1,000 bombers flew that day, escorted by 800 fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts and the new P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks that let them reach Berlin and back. German controllers tracked the formations and scrambled everything they had. Bf-109s, FW-190s, even outdated Bf-110s pulled from night fighter duties. The dogfights stretched across 200 miles of airspace. Contrails wove patterns like chalk on a blackboard. Bombers went down trailing smoke and fire. Fighters spun into the earth. Parachutes dotted the sky. But the bombers kept coming, wave after wave, each formation releasing its ordnance over the target and turning for home while the next group lined up for its run. German pilots, many of them teenagers with 20 hours of training, rammed bombers when their ammunition ran out. It didn't matter. For every bomber lost, 3 more appeared. By February 25, Big Week was over. The 8th Air Force had flown nearly 4,000 sorties and dropped 10,000 tons of explosives. They had lost 226 bombers and 28 fighters. German production dropped by 30% and never recovered. Göring, receiving the casualty reports, reportedly said, "The Americans have an air force now. We have an air show." The human cost of that production was measured in the small tragedies that never made headlines. In Willow Run, a woman named Dorothy Chen, whose husband was fighting in the Pacific, fell asleep at her rivet gun after a double shift and drove a rivet through her thumb. She wrapped it in gauze, finished her shift, and reported to the infirmary at dawn. The doctors saved the thumb, but she lost fine motor control. She was reassigned to final inspection, walking the line with a flashlight, checking for gaps in seams and missed rivets. She was better at it than most because her injury made her paranoid. She checked everything twice. In Seattle, a night shift foreman named William Ortiz worked 70 hours a week for 18 months straight, sending his paychecks to his parents in Texas while living on coffee and canteen soup. He collapsed in the factory parking lot in July 1944 and was dead of a heart attack before the ambulance arrived. He was 34. The plant manager gave a speech at the memorial service about sacrifice and duty. The workers went back to the line the same day because the B-29s bound for the Pacific couldn't wait. In Baltimore, where the Glenn L. Martin Company built bombers and patrol aircraft, a black welder named Elijah Crane was refused promotion to crew chief 3 times despite having the highest quality scores in his division. He kept welding, kept training new hires, kept showing up when others quit. When the war ended, he was laid off within a week. He didn't talk about his war work for 30 years. These were the people who built the 100,000 aircraft that Göring had declared impossible. They weren't heroes in the cinematic sense. They didn't charge machine gun nests or fly through flak. They just showed up day after day and did repetitive, exhausting work because it was required, and because they believed, however abstractly, that it mattered. Evelyn's role evolved as the war progressed. By the summer of 1944, she was no longer testing propellers. She had been promoted to shift supervisor, overseeing final assembly quality control for the entire Burbank plant. She walked miles each day, clipboard in hand, checking torque logs, hydraulic pressure tests, electrical continuity reports. She had a reputation for being strict but fair. She never blamed a worker for an honest mistake, but she would ground an entire aircraft if she found a single loose connector. The crews called her the Ice Queen behind her back, a nickname she heard and never acknowledged. At night in the dormitory, she wrote letters of her own, not to bomber crews but to her mother, who still lived in Iowa and still asked when Evelyn was coming home. Evelyn didn't know how to answer. The factory had become home in a way the schoolhouse never had. She had purpose here, tangible and measurable. Every bomber that passed her final inspection was a theorem proven correct, a problem solved. She had supervised the assembly of 237 aircraft by September 1944, and she knew everyone by tail number. She kept a logbook with notes. B-24J45 Co., tail 4251234, nose gear shimmy corrected, cleared for flight 900 Sep 12. The log filled 3 notebooks. She wondered if anyone would ever read them, or if they would end up in a warehouse somewhere, forgotten data in a forgotten war. The German response to American production was a mixture of denial, desperation, and tactical innovation that ultimately changed nothing. Luftwaffe engineers developed the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, capable of speeds approaching 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter. It was a brilliant machine, decades ahead of its time. Germany built approximately 1,400 of them. The problem was fuel, pilots, and parts. The jet engines devoured fuel at 3 times the rate of conventional engines, and by late 1944, German refineries were rubble. Pilots trained to fly piston-engine fighters struggled with the jet's acceleration and stall characteristics. Parts broke constantly, and replacement turbine blades required rare alloys that were in short supply. Most critically, the Me-262s were outnumbered. An American pilot in a P-51 Mustang might encounter a jet once in 10 missions. The jet pilot encountered 50 Mustangs every mission. Quality, as Göring had insisted, could not defeat quantity when the quantity gap was 50-1. German factories, bombed by day by the Americans and by night by the British, resorted to dispersing production into forests, caves, and underground facilities. Slave labor from concentration camps assembled components in tunnels carved from solid rock. The workers, starved and beaten, sabotaged what they could: loose bolts, crossed wires, scratched bearings. German aircraft rolled off the line with built-in failures. By contrast, American factory workers, paid decent wages, fed in subsidized canteens, and given childcare, had every incentive to build well. The moral dimension of production proved as decisive as the mechanical. People who are treated with dignity build better machines. The air war reached its crescendo in the spring of 1945, when formations of American bombers flew over Germany in daylight with no fighter escort, not because escorts weren't available, but because they weren't needed. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. On March 18, 1,200 American bombers struck Berlin in broad daylight. They encountered fewer than 40 German fighters. The city, already devastated by British night raids, was hammered again. Göring, by this time stripped of most of his titles and authority, was hiding in Bavaria, morphine-addicted and delusional. In his rare moments of lucidity, he reportedly asked aides how many planes the Americans had built. When told the number exceeded 90,000, he refused to believe it. The figure was incomprehensible. His entire worldview, built on assumptions of German superiority and Allied weakness, could not accommodate the reality of American industrial power. He had laughed at 50,000 planes. He had been wrong by a factor of 2, and that error had cost Germany the war. Not immediately and not alone. There were 1,000 other factors, from Hitler's strategic blunders to the Soviet advance from the east. But the air war was lost in the factories of Detroit, Burbank, Seattle, and Wichita long before it was decided in the skis over Berlin. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, Evelyn Kellerman was 35 years old and exhausted in ways she couldn't articulate. The Burbank plant held a celebration: bunting, a brass band, speeches from executives who had never set foot on the factory floor. She didn't attend. She walked to the edge of the airfield where completed bombers sat in rows, awaiting transport orders that would never come. She sat on the tarmac, back against a landing gear strut, and watched the sun set behind the San Gabriel Mountains. The aircraft around her, gleaming in the golden light, represented something she struggled to define. They were instruments of violence, yes, each one designed to carry bombs and destruction. But they were also instruments of precision, products of millions of hours of labor by people who had believed in something larger than themselves. She thought about the letters in her locker, the ones from crews who had flown these machines into flak and fire and brought them home because someone in California had torqued a bolt correctly. She thought about Thomas, whose body was somewhere at the bottom of the North Sea, inside a B-24 she might have helped build. The war had taken him and given her nothing in return except the knowledge that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. It was a bitter trade. She would have given it all back, the job, the letters, the purpose, for one more Sunday dinner with her brother. But the trade had been made and she couldn't undo it. She could only carry it forward. The final tally was recorded by the U.S. War Production Board in its summary report, published in October 1945. American factories had produced 324,750 aircraft between 1940 and 1945. Of those, 99,950 were combat aircraft, bombers, fighters, attack planes. The rest were trainers, transports, and reconnaissance planes. The number exceeded Göring's mocked figure of 50,000 by a factor of 2, precisely as he had failed to imagine. Germany, by comparison, produced approximately 119,000 aircraft across the same period, many of them obsolete by the time they reached the front. The Soviet Union produced 157,000, though many were simple designs built for short operational lifespans. Britain produced 131,000. Japan produced 76,000. America alone had built more combat aircraft than Germany and Japan combined. The scale was staggering, and it represented a permanent shift in global power. The country that had been dismissed as a producer of automobiles and household appliances had demonstrated an industrial capacity that no nation could match. The lesson was clear. Wars are not won solely by courage or tactics or even technology. They are won by logistics, by the ability to build, supply, and sustain forces faster than the enemy can destroy them. Göring had laughed because he couldn't imagine a different way of making war. America had shown him. Evelyn stayed in California after the war, though the factory laid off 80% of its workforce within 3 months of Japan's surrender. She found work as a high school mathematics teacher in Glendale, a quieter life that suited her middle age. She never married, never spoke much about her war work. When students asked, she would say she had worked in a factory and leave it at that. But she kept the logbooks, the 3 notebooks filled with tail numbers and inspection data, and she kept the letters, the 43 that had arrived and the hundreds more that came in the years after the war from veterans who had learned her name from squadron records. She answered some of them, brief notes thanking them for writing, wishing them well. She never told them about Thomas. That was private. In 1968, a documentary film crew visited her classroom, researching a piece on women in wartime industry. They asked if she felt proud of what she had done. She considered the question for a long time, the camera running, the young interviewer waiting. Finally, she said, "I did the job I was given. I did it well, that's all." The interview was cut from the final film. It wasn't dramatic enough, the director said, but the answer was honest. She had done the job, and the job had mattered, and that was enough. The sky over Germany in the final months of the war was a strange and terrible thing, a canvas of contrails and burning metal, a space where the rules of physics and human endurance were tested to their limits. American crews, flying their 30th or 35th missions, looked down on cities reduced to rubble and felt a mixture of relief and guilt. They had won, but the cost of winning had been written in fire across an entire continent. German civilians, huddled in basements, heard the drone of engines and knew there was no defense, no shelter that could withstand what was coming. The Luftwaffe pilots, the few who remained, flew with a fatalism that bordered on nihilism. They knew they were going to die. The only question was whether they would take anyone with them. And above it all, the bombers flew in their precise formations, untouchable and inevitable, the physical manifestation of an industrial power that Göring had mocked and underestimated. The sky had become American property, purchased with aluminum and sweat and the blood of 50,000 airmen who never came home. It was a sky that no longer belonged to eagles or gods or empires. It belonged to the people who built the machines that ruled it, people like Evelyn Kellerman, whose names would never appear in history books but whose work had rewritten the map of the world. In the end, Göring's laughter echoes across history as a monument to the danger of underestimating one's adversary. He laughed because he believed in the mythology of German excellence, in the superiority of European craftsmanship and military tradition. He laughed because he could not imagine a system that valued production over perfection, scale over skill. He laughed because he assumed that making war was an art form, practiced by professionals, governed by centuries of precedent. He did not understand that America was about to turn war into an industrial process, a problem of logistics and throughput and supply chains. He did not understand that a democracy of farmers and factory workers could, when threatened, reorganize itself into the most efficient killing machine the world had ever seen. His laughter was the sound of an old world dying, the world of knights and chivalry and individual heroism. What replaced it was something colder and more terrifying, the world of assembly lines and statistics, where victory went not to the bravest or the most skilled, but to the side that could produce more, faster, and keep producing until the enemy drowned in the weight of material. Göring lived to see that world triumph, though he did not live to understand it. He was captured in May 1945, tried at Nuremberg, and sentenced to death. He committed suicide the night before his execution, swallowing a cyanide capsule he had hidden for months. His final words were not recorded. Perhaps he spent them thinking about the American planes, the 100,000 aircraft he had declared impossible, and wondering how he had been so wrong. Evelyn Kellerman died in 1987 at the age of 77 in a hospice in Pasadena. She left no children, no spouse, no immediate family. Her estate was modest, the house she had lived in for 40 years, a savings account with $18,000 and 14 boxes of papers. The executor, a nephew she had seen 3 times in her life, hired an estate sale company to clear the house. They found the logbooks and the letters in a closet, packed in a wooden crate wrapped in oilcloth. The letters were brittle, the ink fading. The logbooks were pristine, each entry dated and signed. The estate sale company didn't know what to do with them. They weren't valuable. No collector wanted production logs from a forgotten factory. They were going to throw them away when a historian from the Smithsonian, researching a book on women in wartime manufacturing, heard about the find and drove to Pasadena. She bought the entire collection for $500. The logbooks are now in the National Air and Space Museum, archived as part of the Homefront production collection. The letters are stored separately, in climate-controlled vaults, available to researchers by appointment. Evelyn's name appears in 2 books and a documentary that aired on public television in 1995. She is described as typical of the women who contributed to the war effort, which is both accurate and insufficient. She was typical in that she did ordinary work with extraordinary diligence. She was extraordinary in that she understood better than most that the war would be won or lost in the mundane details, the torque values, the inspection logs, the letters written to strangers who flew machines she would never see in combat. She understood that history is made not only by generals and politicians, but by people who show up and do the work, day after day, until the work is finished. The legacy of those 100,000 aircraft is written in the architecture of the modern world. The factories that built them were converted after the war to produce commercial airliners, helicopters, missiles, spacecraft. The workers who assembled them carried their skills into the suburbs, building houses and schools and shopping centers. The engineers who designed them became the pioneers of jet propulsion, supersonic flight, and eventually, space travel. The pilots who flew them became airline captains, flight instructors, and aviation executives. The war transformed America from an industrial power into the industrial power, the nation that defined what mass production meant. But the transformation came at a cost that is difficult to calculate. 50,000 American airmen died in combat over Europe and the Pacific. Hundreds of thousands more were injured, physically and psychologically. Millions of workers sacrificed years of their lives to repetitive, exhausting labor. Entire cities were reshaped around the demands of wartime production, their populations doubling in months, their infrastructure strained to breaking. And when the war ended, the factories closed, the workers were laid off, and the machines that had been so urgently needed became scrap metal. The victory was real, but it was not clean and it was not cheap. It was purchased with the collective effort of a generation that was asked to give everything and did, because the alternative was unthinkable. Göring's laughter, then, was not just a miscalculation of numbers. It was a failure of imagination, an inability to grasp the scale of human potential when properly mobilized. He laughed at 50,000 planes because he could not imagine the factories in Willow Run and Burbank and Seattle. He could not imagine Evelyn Kellerman walking a production line at 2 in the morning, checking torque values with numb fingers. He could not imagine Marcus Webb loading crated fighters onto Liberty ships in the rain. He could not imagine Dorothy Chen inspecting rivets with a bandaged thumb. He could not imagine a nation of ordinary people, none of them soldiers, none of them heroes in the traditional sense, coming together to build a war machine that would bury his dreams of empire under 10,000 tons of high explosive. He could not imagine it because his worldview, rooted in hierarchy and tradition and the belief in inherent superiority, had no place for the possibility that democracy, messy and inefficient as it was, could mobilize resources and human effort on a scale that no dictatorship could match. He was wrong, and his laughter was the last sound of a world that no longer existed. The sky in the end remembers everything. The contrails fade, the engines fall silent, the aluminum corrodes and returns to dust. But the fact remains. America built the planes, flew the missions, won the war. The 100,000 aircraft that Göring declared impossible became the instrument of his defeat. They filled the sky over Europe until there was no room left for the Luftwaffe, until German pilots were grounded for lack of fuel and spare parts, until the factories that built the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were craters in the earth. The sky remembers, even if history forgets the names of the people who made it happen. Somewhere in the Smithsonian archives, Evelyn Kellerman's logbooks sit in a box, 3 notebooks filled with tail numbers and inspection dates, a paper monument to the work that no one saw but everyone relied upon. The sky over Berlin, once the domain of eagles, became American property because people like Evelyn showed up and did the work. That is the lesson, stark and undeniable. Wars are not won by those who laugh at their enemies, but by those who build more, work harder, and refuse to quit until the job is finished. Göring laughed. America built. And the sky, indifferent to both, recorded the outcome.